Whether or not you're a fan of sports, sports is an undeniable part of American culture. One example of this is the Super Bowl. A ton of people who don't even like football at all or don't even understand the rules all come together at Super Bowl parties to spend this time with friends and look at the funny commercials, and it's an important cultural event here in America. We even put our kids in Pop Warner and youth basketball leagues so that they can learn hard work, discipline, and good values. But before basketball and football and the Tom Brady's and the LeBron James of the world, what did the American sports scene look like? What sports were there? What role did they play, if any, outside of solely entertainment for those involved? In this video, that's what I'd like to address. What was early American sport, and what impact did it have in society? I will start early, going from the colonial period here in what we now know as America, and moving forward all the way up until around 1870. My hope is that by the end of this video, you'll have learned something new about the early American sports scene and see beyond just the entertainment aspect of it, but the important role it played for the people who were involved. So let's get started.
To be able to understand sport in early America, we also have to understand taverns. In our day and age, we're very used to attending domes or big sold-out arenas to observe sporting events. But during colonial and early American times, taverns were the sporting hubs. Inside of taverns, one could find a variety of different games, such as card and dice games, billiards, cockfighting, and wrestling and fist fighting. Seems weird to us that a pub owner or a bartender would want or promote a fight in his establishment, but during this time it was very common that bartenders in the tavern would permit and promote fights and make a little bit of money off of them as well. One of the most popular tavern sports, though, was cockfighting. By 1740, cockfighting became a normal part of tavern life. It became so popular, in fact, that tavern keepers would even make their own pits where the roosters could face off and would even lay down boards over the top of the pit. The way cockfighting worked is that two roosters were set against each other, and the people would attach steel-pointed gaffs to their talons to be able to draw deadly blows from the opposing rooster. The fights would go until either one of the roosters was dead or that one was so maimed it couldn't go on. It was honestly a pretty gruesome spectacle, and a woman during the time, Elkanah Watson, gave her statement after she observed a cockfight and just the gruesome nature of it. She said, "In viewing the crowd, I was deeply astonished to find men of character and intelligence giving their countenance to an amusement so frivolous and scandalous, so abhorrent to every feeling of humanity, and so injurious in its moral influence." So we can tell that these were pretty gruesome spectacles, but very popular at the time. Something interesting about cockfighting was that free men, slaves, and women all played on the same field. They had even footing in this competition. It wasn't uncommon to see a slave or a free black man go against a wealthy white owner and put their roosters against each other, or a woman and a free man. It was honestly maybe the only place during the time where everyone had equal footing and played on the same playing field. Something that was also interesting is a great deal of money was invested in cockfighting. Wealthy landowners would import special fowl that had increased limb speed and extra aggressiveness, and they'd feed them special diets, and they'd even sometimes hire other people to train their roosters and get them ready for upcoming fights. While there was a great deal of competition and gambling inside taverns, there was also a great deal of sport to be had outside. One of the sports that you could see people playing outside taverns was cricket. Another one was a more primitive version of bowling, where 9 pins would be set up in an alley next to a tavern, and competitors would roll a wooden ball or a stone and try and knock down all 9 pins. Another popular game of the time was quoit. In the game of quoit, a stake would be set up a good deal away, and competitors would throw a disc or an object and try and get as close to the stake as possible. This game would later evolve and develop into what we know now as horseshoes. Another popular sport of the time was horse racing, and horse racing took on a life of its own in Virginia. In almost every town in Virginia, horse races would be held annually. One man said that horses are the pride and joy of the men of Virginia. A lot of money would be gambled on these races as well, and a lot of money invested in obtaining the best horses and breeding them and giving them a correct diet so they'd have their best chance to win. It would be unfair to talk about early American sport without acknowledging American lacrosse. Although these lacrosse games were slightly different than the ones we know now. The games usually went to 100 goals. There would be betting on these games, and the goalposts were made out of wooden timber set in the ground with one other wooden timber set on top as a goalpost. These games were very physical, with scrums for the ball lasting several minutes, and many leaving these scrums with black eyes and bruised shin bones and broken noses. They were very competitive, but at the end of each day of lacrosse, the Indians would drink together and put any bad feelings aside. Another important sports moment in early American history would be the Great Foot Race of 1835, which took place in Long Island. In Long Island, a prize was put out for $1,300 for whoever could run 10 miles in the span of 1 hour. 10 runners stepped up to the table to try and complete the challenge, but in the end, only farmer Henry Stannard of Connecticut was able to make it under the hour mark with 12 minutes to spare, even taking a break in the middle of the race to take a shot of whiskey. An interesting sporting phenomenon of the 19th century was slave boxing. On weekends, where slaves didn't have to work, either on their own or organized by the slaveholder, there would be boxing and foot races and dancing. It also wasn't uncommon for slaveholders of different plantations to set their slaves against each other in boxing matches for money. Why would a slave want to compete in these boxing matches? Well, the prize fighters had certain benefits that other slaves didn't have. They would often have reduced workloads, better diet. They'd often be set as a position of authority on the plantation over other slaves, and they would have greater respect from the slave community if they would win their boxing bouts. So it would make sense why they'd want these perks, and that's why many of them continued to fight other slaves on their same plantation and on other plantations as well. Another popular but gruesome sport was rat baiting. We have records of rat baiting dating back to as early as 1860. The way rat baiting worked is that a location would be put out only to a select few, and spectators were admitted for 25 cents a head, and they would go down a trap door down into a cellar where there would be an octagon arena. There in this octagon arena, a barrel of rats would be released, and a dog would be released to eat and kill and pick up the rats as quickly as possible. Bets would be placed on how quick the dog could kill all the rats, and money was lost and made down in these cellars. Between 1840 and 1870, we can start to see a great change in the sporting culture of America and the way sport is perceived. Before this time, sport had been perceived in a negative light. We can understand why this might be the case after hearing about rat baiting and cockfighting and slave boxing and other gruesome sports. However, thanks to a series of religious revivals known as the Second Great Awakening, reformers saw a new opportunity to create clean, wholesome sport that would be appropriate for youth and adult alike. People like Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who criticized the American clergy for not being in good physical health to perform their jobs. And he insisted that physical fitness shouldn't just be a secular thing. It should be a part of God-fearing men's lives as well. And women like Catherine Beecher, who criticized women's frailty and said that they should be exercising and taking care of their bodies better. These people helped promote a new culture, a new wave of sport that would have effects long after this time period. In the push for new, clean, healthy sport, the game of baseball began to flourish in America. One example of this was the forming of the New York Knickerbocker Baseball Club and them adopting their own set of rules and regulations to the game. Another milestone for this reform in sport was the founding of the New York Athletic Club in 1868, one of the first of its kind, and would set the tone for later for YMCAs to be built and having places where youth and adults alike could go and get good exercise and associate with his or her peers. I hope after hearing this, you can appreciate the contributions that Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Catherine Beecher made for sporting culture in the 1800s. Because without the contributions of reformists like them, we wouldn't have the sports landscape that we do today. Without their push for clean sport where respect, discipline, physical activity was emphasized, we probably wouldn't have the NBA, the NFL, the different leagues, the different rec centers and YMCAs that we have around the country. Because there's a good chance that sporting would still be something that's done in the shadows, that's seen as a form of idleness, as something that is a perverse culture. So we really got to be thankful for the efforts that they gave to set this foundation that others could build upon. I don't think James Naismith invents basketball in the YMCA if we don't have the strides that others made beforehand to change the way sport is perceived. So I hope you learned something new about early American sport culture and the different sports that there were and the role they played in society, and thank you for listening.